slow this down is this focus on making a step change and getting out of our existing energy system and starting something brand new. That is going to be a long, costly process. 63% of our emissions right now are from oil and gas. That's an awful lot of emissions. And if we're going to be serious about reducing those emissions at the scale we need to, we all need to step up.
Facilitating the speed of innovation and the speed of the scale up, that's my big hope for COP28. Every decision we make should be geared to say, does this advance to 1.5 degrees, or is it going to be more destructive and take us in the wrong direction?
How do you make big polluters pay for the carbon emissions that they emit?
Without carbon price, it won't happen fast enough. Create the transparency of the paradigm of reporting on how you look like in terms of the path to carbon neutrality, walking the talk and showing that we move it.
Next session now. It's a jam-packed schedule, isn't it, here at the Filecoin Sanctuary? And we're going to focus now on the CNBC Sustainable Future Forum. Now, for those of you who don't know anything about that, it's a collection of global thought leaders exploring the big issues that grow business as well as the sustainability. The forum was seen in Dubai. I was there in person. COP28 was an amazing event. And we're going to continue those conversations here in Davos. So please welcome onto the stage now the CNBC anchor and Middle East correspondent Dan Murphy with his fantastic panelists. Dan, a big round of applause. Come on up and join us. Hi, welcome.
Thank you, Anne.
Welcome to the Sanctuary. I shall leave the floor to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Murphy. I'm CNBC's Middle East correspondent. I host our program Capital Connection weekdays in the Middle East, based out of the UAE. So I'm really grateful that you're all sticking around for this next conversation. As most of you know, COP28 wrapped up in Dubai in the fourth quarter of last year with a really big call. And the call was to transition away from fossil fuels. Not a phase out, not a phase down, but a transition away. The agreement was broadly hailed by corporates and the business community as a success, as well as intergovernmental organizations that were on the ground. But of course, what we know is that 2023 was indeed the hottest year on record. So the onus of responsibility to really move the needle on climate now falls upon corporates and governments. So this conversation is really going to focus on what needs to happen in order to move that needle. So I am so thrilled to introduce my panel for this next conversation. Please make them feel welcome. Badr Jafar is the CEO of Crescent Group and Special Representative for Business and Philanthropy at COP28. Badr, welcome. Please make him feel welcome. Also joining me is Daniel Feldman, a partner at Covington, and he also served as the former Chief of Staff and Counselor to Secretary John Kerry, while, of course, Secretary Kerry served as Special Representative for Envoy for Climate. Daniel, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And Rachel Kite is also here. She's founding co-chair of the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, or VCMI. Rachel, welcome to you as well. Thank you. Please take a seat. So thank you again all for joining me. And I know I did get the opportunity to speak with some of you at COP28 in Dubai. We had days and days of coverage on CNBC. And one of the key themes we were talking about on the ground there was not just the role of business and governments, but of course the role of COP28 itself. And so I wanted to talk specifically about the outcomes here. If you could give COP a score, how would you rank it? And how credible is this call to transition away from fossil fuels? Badr, I'll start with you.
A score out of what?
Maybe a score out of 10.
So a very positively biased 11. I mean, look, well, first of all, great pleasure to be sitting with you all on a nice and sunny Davos day. So it's been just over 30 days since COP28. And in case you're wondering, yes, we are all still suffering withdrawal symptoms, waking up in the middle of the night, sweating about loss and damage fund and decarbonization accelerators. But COP28, for me, was really a moment where the world came together to agree on and to deliver on the UAE consensus as a response to the first ever global stocktake. There were a number of, I think, unprecedented outcomes, including the fact that 198 or so countries came together to agree, as you mentioned, on the transition away from fossil fuels in an orderly, just and equitable manner towards net zero, also agreed to triple renewables, double energy efficiency, to double adaptation, managed to bring together $85 billion in new commitments really across the spectrum of the climate and nature action agenda, operationalized the loss and damage fund, delivered on many outcomes, including health and education. And this was all before breakfast. But look, for me, what really the COP represents, and to go to your question, was the inclusivity aspect that really Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, as president of COP28, identified and outlined at the get-go, realizing that we will only really make significant and authentic headway on big issues, big existential issues like climate change and nature degradation, if we can come together across sectors, across geographies, across communities of the world, and that's what COP28 managed to achieve. We had about 90,000 people who attended, and yes, maybe that was a record in terms of numbers, but again, it's what that number represented. It was really across heads of state and ministers that you would expect at a COP meeting, but really an unprecedented engagement by business, by philanthropy, by civil society, by indigenous peoples, by youth, really coming together, building on their respective strengths, not canceling each other out, building on their respective strengths to deliver a much more ambitious climate and nature action agenda. And that's exactly what underpinned the inaugural COP28 Business and Philanthropy Climate Forum, which was the first ever engagement opportunity right up front, so alongside the Leaders Summit or the World Climate Action Summit, where we saw 1,300 or so CEOs, 40% of which were from the great nations across the global south, 40% women representation, and really spanning the whole spectrum of industry, from energy to finance, from space to fashion, and 400 heads of philanthropies, again from over 40 nations in the world, coming together to help to generate and create that multiplier effect on impact, bringing together government capital with business capital and philanthropic capital. And that forum itself alone helped to generate $7 billion in new private sector commitments towards the climate and nature action agenda. So again, it's the inclusivity dimension which I think really underpinned the success of COP28, and which I believe will be carried forward into COP29 and COP30, and really should underpin all the multilateral efforts that we are engaging in today to solve the world's greatest challenges.
I agree with your point. I think what's perhaps most interesting about COP28 was that we saw business being built in rather than bolted on, because throughout COPs of the past, business hasn't necessarily been central to the conversation, and the amount of climate financing commitments that we saw in COP28 really reflects the ongoing role of the private sector at future COPs now, I think.
Yeah, and if I might just add, and this is a personal reflection, that's perhaps why previous COPs haven't perhaps been as effective in action and implementation as they have been in announcements and pledges, is because the private sector wasn't properly integrated into the process. And this is where, if done properly, the private sector, I think, can act as a glue that helps to, or the connective tissue, if you will, that helps to bind one COP presidency to the other and deliver consistent action throughout the year, not just from one big summit to another big summit a year later. So this is precisely what we need to try and do, and we've been having many discussions with the United Nations, and more specifically the UNFCCC, to figure out how we can do that and institutionalize business, and more specifically business and philanthropy, in the COP process going forward.
We'll come back to that point. So Badr has given me an 11. Dan, over to you. What's your view when it comes to scoring COP28, and how credible is this call to transition away from fossil fuels?
So on scoring, I'm traditionally a hard grader. I would say if you were evaluating it compared to what they hoped would be achieved and what they hoped would come out of a negotiated agreement, it was close to 10. I'd say looking at it from what's needed to actually make the difference that the global stocktake raised, and which all the science day by day is showing us that we're still wildly off course. And as COPs go in terms of what its legacy will be, and if we use this inflection point in history, I'd say a 7. I think it was overarchingly positive. I think it's much like the Winston Churchill quote on democracy. It's flawed, but it's still better than anything else out there. There's lots of criticisms about COP. Why didn't we get an agreement like this 30 years ago? And it may well be years too late, but it's important that we did it now. I do think that what makes it most significant and what we have to continue to really keep our eyes on is the implementation and operationalization. That's what, we have to go from the rhetoric of the commitments to actually implementing it. And that's where I think the engagement of the private sector is so critical. This cannot be done without corporations really systemically institutionalizing it. And we're seeing that, and I think the broad engagement and inclusivity is very, very important for that to happen. But there has to continue to be real accountability, oversight, and a scrutiny to make sure that this is moving forward, or we won't come anywhere close to meeting mid-century net zero goals. I mean, as we've seen from the science, we're not there yet as we approach 2030 and those goals, let alone 2050. And so making sure that we keep everyone engaged in that way will be the key part. And I think the private sector has a remarkably important role in that.
The UAE being a systemically important producer of fossil fuels obviously got a lot of headlines in the lead up to COP28. There were some who said that oil and gas as an industry is genuinely part of the problem, so they should be part of the solution. There were others who said it's impossible for this industry to be involved in at all, and the UAE, because of its vested economic interests, could perhaps influence or tilt the conversation in favor of those fossil fuel producers. What's your view? Oil and gas being part of the conversation, net negative or net positive on the outcome? Would that have changed the 7 to a 10?
No, I come from a diplomatic background. I've been back and forth with in the State Department for many years. And so I firmly believe that we have to have all key actors at the table. There is no solution to this without having oil and gas producers and the major states which produce that as part of this discussion. I think there has to be, again, real legitimacy. We have to really ensure that there's not the greenwashing that I think frequently comes with this, that actions are being measured and that there's repercussions if there's not actions. But I think that they have to, again, we don't get anywhere close to meeting net zero goals unless it's that the oil and gas industry as a whole is part of this conversation. So yes, we need to move much more rapidly to renewables. I think that in terms of what was laid out as a goal in the relative short term, the next 2-5 years, of course, we're not going to see that. Over the next generation or two, we have to see it. And how quickly we do it, how we seize this opportunity of the energy transition, and again, how that's really institutionalized state by state, company by company, is really going to be where the difference is felt on, is 1.5 even remotely alive, and how quickly can we get there?
Absolutely fair point. Rachel, welcome into the conversation. It's great to have you here as well. So what's your view? What score do you give COP28 and this question of credibility regarding the transition away from fossil fuels?
Well, so I think in terms of, I liked your diplomatic framing. So in terms of what the UAE said it wanted to achieve, then it's a 10, because that first 72 hours was pledge after pledge after pledge on every possible matrix. And I think the presidency did a very good job to put food on the agenda, to put health on the agenda. We had cooling pledges and methane pledges and whatever. The problem is that from a multilateral standpoint, they're pledges, so it's a 5. That's not necessarily the presidency's fault. It's the intergovernmental community's inability to meet the science. And I think that COP28 was also very important because we kind of pulled the Band-Aid off. We do not have global unanimity on the urgency of the transition that is necessary, or the way in which that transition is going to play out. Within hours of the agreement, and I think it was an important agreement, and it's important diplomatic language, we had member states saying, well, actually, I'm not going to be bound by that. And so rather than sort of pretending like we don't have a disagreement, we have a number of countries who are oil and gas producers whose business model is that by the middle to the second half of the century, they'll still be in the fossil fuel production business, but they'll be the best at it, the cheapest at it, and that's fine if it meets the science. If it doesn't meet the science, then it's not fine. So I think COP28 sort of just laid it all out, right? Here we are, it's like a family meal, we don't all agree. And so there's lots of work to be done now. But I think that finance is the piece that always pulls the puzzle together. If there is trade, if there's a terms of trade that works for the world, if there is investment flowing into emerging markets and developing economies, if the cost of capital is reasonable, then everybody can come to perhaps a better or a more a larger agreement. And I think that what we also saw at COP28 is that without that financial deal on the table, it's very difficult, especially for emerging markets, developing economies, to come and sort of, make all of the agreements that are necessary. But COP28 has to be the sort of last pledge COP, right? We've got to get from pledges to binding commitments. But I think, everybody was there, and, it's an effective presidency that gets everybody there. Now we're all there. Now we've got to go beyond just pledging.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, Rachel. And to that point, one of the major criticisms of COP is that what we see on the ground are promises made that don't eventually become promises kept. So to follow up on that, what would you say are the mechanisms that are needed to ensure that what is said at COP ends up becoming what is done?
So the UN, is traditionally the place where governments are held to account. And it's going to be very important now because we're going into a second generation of nationally determined contributions. They have to be total economy and all gases. So there's no sort of plausible deniability, well, we're just going to make this about renewable energy. Everything's in now, and countries will need a lot of help. And countries have to hold themselves to account. That's how the UN works. The charter begins with we the peoples, right? It's not the Secretary General's job or the UNFCCC's Secretariat's job. They make it all transparent, but we have to hold each other to account within the international system. What's a really struggle now, I think, but there's incredible work going on, is how to hold non-state actors in diplomatic language to account. How do you hold companies to account? How do you hold cities and regions and other actors to account? Now, of course, in an ideal world, governments would be regulating the Paris Agreement. We would have banking supervision everywhere. We would have financial regulations everywhere that sort of say, if you're going to promise to be net zero, then you better actually be net zero. We're not quite in that world yet. The EU is moving, Singapore's moving, the US is sort of moving, the UK is moving, others are moving. But that needs to be a global movement. So what we need to see over the next couple of years really is a move from voluntary into better supervised accountability for non-state actors when they promise, so that if the oil and gas industry stands up and says, okay, we're going to X out methane from gas operations by 2030, there's a consequence to them not doing so.
Sure, Dan, you go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. I was just going to follow up on Rachel's point, because I think you've just perfectly outlined both the remarkable opportunities and also the real limits of structures like these, and why it can't just be the UNFCCC in isolation, but it has to be a much broader stakeholder initiative with corporations at the table. On the one hand, government regulatory action is incredibly important in all this, and you just referenced some of this. In our work advising companies, there's been this remarkable sea change from voluntary commitments to the regulatory framework. Everyone for the last few years has been focused on when is the SEC's final climate risk disclosure rule going to come out, and yet in the last 6 months, it's almost been superseded, because in the EU you have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the fact that many companies will have to start reporting on Scope 1, 2, and 3. In California, they've just passed 3 pieces of legislation, one of which came into effect on January 1st, and again affects greenwashing claims and what we do with offsets. There's other jurisdictions, and so companies are looking at this and saying, we can't afford to hold back. We need a global systemic approach, and so we have to start institutionalizing this much more quickly and much more comprehensively. And so that is really driving a change in corporations. And I think that will, that will continue to be augmented because there's so much in the works, particularly coming out of the EU, but in a range of other jurisdictions. By the same token, you mentioned finance, which is absolutely right. And I can say from working in government, I mean, we all spent countless hours trying to think about how we maximize sovereign state contributions to some of these funds. And the fact is, even if we're giving several $1 billion, that's such a drop in the bucket of what's needed to fuel the energy transition. And by all, kind of research and accounts, it's going to be $2, $3, $4 trillion a year that's needed in some of this. And that can't be done without corporate partners and unleashing the private sector to move forward in that way. And so I do think you'll continue to see this progression into the regulatory framework. It's quite important. There has to be accountability. It's why I think the stock take was so important. It's why COP in 2025, next year, is going to be particularly important with the new NDCs demanded. And why we have to keep measuring how close we are to 2030. We have to keep focused on what's being done. For us to get anywhere close to 2050 net zero goals means we really have to have half of that done by 2030. And if you're going to get anywhere close to half by 2030, you need regulatory impacts now. I mean, this is the critical year or two, and companies adapting all that. And that is happening episodically, but not comprehensively, and we're not nearly, obviously, on pace to do that.
Badr, can you speak to this as well, and in particular to this point of how do we ensure that promises made are promises kept when it comes to the conclusion of COPs like the one we saw in Dubai?
So in many ways, your line of questioning, but also the insights that you're getting really goes to the crux of both the challenge, but also the opportunity. If you're using suboptimal machinery to solve these challenges, you're going to get suboptimal outcomes. So the machinery itself has to be both representative, really, of the whole world, and also have teeth of sorts. So what does that look like for a process like COP? And this is precisely what COP28 and the presidency of COP28 was trying to do. It has the existing system that it needs to work with and work through, but is there an opportunity to, this word is perhaps overused, but disrupt or enhance that system to make sure that both of those things are in place? And again, this is not a one-off sort of conference. It's a year-long process, and it feeds into other presidencies. So it has to be, that continuity has to be there across. So taking the business and philanthropy dimension, what does institutionalization of business and philanthropy look like as part of a COP process? Of course, COP stands for the, Conference of the Parties, hence a national approach. How does one expand that to the partners? How does one make sure that business and philanthropy and also subnational actors at the mayor's level are integrated into the process and not a sort of add-on, as you mentioned? I think that's doable. We will have some exciting announcements to make, including as soon as tomorrow, that really touches on this. And so I'm making this point, as I think you're hearing here, is we have to be careful that, yes, we need to keep pushing governments. Yes, we need to push businesses and make sure businesses are held to account. But we also need to work on building a better system for system change. And I don't think enough of that, quite frankly, has been done. I'm not a COP veteran, as many are. But looking back over the last close to 30 years of experience, the system itself hasn't changed anywhere near as much as the opportunity and the challenge has. So that's something we need to make sure we carry into COP29 and indeed COP30. Just want to make one point, if I may, because philanthropy was mentioned, and I do think that philanthropy plays quite a special role. It's often seen as a relatively small player, and in some parts of the world even regarded with a high degree of suspicion. The reality is philanthropic capital is dispersed in the trillions of dollars a year. What we can measure today is only about $1 trillion, but it's likely closer to $2 trillion or even more. And to put that in perspective, using a climate analogy, at the $1 trillion mark, that's more than 10 times the total amount of climate finance provided by developed countries to developing countries last year. So it's not insignificant, but the most exciting aspect is its quality. The fact that it can be, when deployed in the right ways, more flexible, more risk-tolerant, and more equitable in deployment, and can therefore help to create and generate that multiplier effect to take us from the billions that we have to the trillions that we need. And that's something that I think, again, institutionalizing it, yes, we can call it private sector and private capital, But I do think we also need to call out the unique attributes of these different pools of capital to make sure that when they do come together, they do create that multiplier effect.
I don't want to front run your announcement, but I think you've just given me a scoop. Are you saying that COP is getting a name change?
Not a name change per se, but it's a supplementary process to make sure that we are including the partners on an ongoing basis, on an institutionalized basis. So it will be a game changer.
I don't want to rain on the parade because I think it's really important what business and philanthropy did at COP28. But this is an intergovernmental process. In a year when more people are going to go to the polls than has ever happened in human history before, it is about people holding their governments to account for acting on something that they all agreed to in 2015. And that's really important because some governments are really uncomfortable with anybody other than the government saying what's going to happen, right? They're very happy to have civil society and philanthropy and everything, fine. But when it comes to agreeing, it's my negotiator, it's my elected official, it's my minister, it's my civil servant. And so I think that while we're building these partnerships and while we're delivering, if climate is everything, everything is climate, everybody's working on climate, we do have to strengthen, and this is a challenge for the United Nations beyond just climate. It's our entire sort of international community. But at the end of the day, the people who sign the agreements, the people who stand there and are to be held account are people who, for most countries in the world, are elected, for some not, and they are government representatives. And that's the weakest link at the moment.
Yeah. So the way we talked about it as shorthand in government was that there was COP and there's Greater Metropolitan COP. So COP is exactly the negotiation, how we're getting there, what's being, and that, again, has moved, but more incrementally. It's the Greater Metropolitan COP that has seen this kind of sea change.
Yeah.
And even from Glasgow 2 years ago, which had 30,000 to this with 90,000. And so making sure that that delta is being used in an effective manner, in a credible manner, and it's not just rhetoric and the potential for greenwashing, and how to engage them in the right way, takes its own, enormous amount of energy and coordination. And they're both related in terms of what the ultimate impact and efficiency of the process is, but they are still distinct processes.
And I just make a point, there's no suggestion, and it would be a major issue if this was seen as shifting responsibility per se. But I think there is broad acceptance that it has to be an all of the above approach if we're going to get there. And again, not just with climate and nature. I mean, we were having some discussions earlier today. The UAE is hosting the WTO meetings next month. And I wasn't exactly aware as to how, again, mechanisms for engagement in the private sector, apparently they don't exist. So you're having big discussions about global trade and business is not sitting at the table in an institutionalized way or in a formalized way. So again, I do think there is something to be said about re-looking at these structures and making sure that representative groups are represented. People who, and so many stakeholders are not just being acted upon, but are being acted with or in partnership with. It makes a huge difference, I think, to the outcomes. And we have a case in point with a very recent example in COP28. The energy in the room, when you had business sitting together with philanthropy, with policymakers, was incredible. And we need to capture that and scale it rapidly because, as has been, I think, and again, widely accepted, we're running out of time.
Just speaking of being in the room, Dan, I wanted to ask you about something that will obviously be very close to your heart. In the lead up to COP, in all of the meetings that took place in advance, Secretary Kerry was there in the UAE, on the ground, standing next to Dr. Sultan, standing next to world leaders, making sure that the US had a really significant presence. He has decided to step away from that role. Look, it might be a stretch to ask, but do you have any inside track on what his thinking is, as we come into another really critical COP in Azerbaijan, what that's going to mean for the US's role and presence in this conversation?
I certainly don't have any news to break on what Secretary Kerry will be doing next, and I know he's thinking through that. But his goal is to have as much impact on this set of issues as possible. And he's obviously had remarkable impact in the U.S. I can't think of somebody else that could have elevated this issue in the same way with his degree of credibility on the core climate issues, with his contacts on the global stage, and working so closely with Dr. Sultan and many other colleagues around the world, and with a direct line to the president, and really showing that this set of issues was empowered and elevated. And we worked from day one to make sure that the U.S. was reasserting leadership, from entering Paris Agreement on day one to the internationally determined contribution that we put forward within the first 100 days, and then obviously financing it through the IRA and the ability to actually try to move forward. It's all so important. There's also so much more to be done. And I think we worked as well to make sure that there's a lot of very legitimate questions on what happens with America come this November, and if there were to be a second Trump term, what that would look like. And I hope, have done enough to future-proof this as best as possible. That was certainly what we told all of our partners around the world as of day one. And I think through things like the IRA, to have the economic genie out of the bottle. The private sector is now engaged in this way. And as we're seeing in the energy transition in the U.S., I think the IRA has this is the Investment Reduction Act, the greatest climate investment in history, I think, of any country. But it's disproportionately impacting and benefiting many red states who are seeing the benefits. And so I think as people see this as an opportunity and an economic opportunity to make sure that we are part of this new global trend, hopefully it means that we can't take too many steps backward, because we don't have the time. This has to be a moment when we're accelerating.
Just to talk politics for a second, there's a non-negligible risk that President Trump will come back. He just came out of the Iowa caucuses with a big win. What do you think that would mean for U.S. climate outcomes?
Well, again, I'm hoping that much of what we've laid the groundwork for will continue to exist in some ways. I think once there's a constituency that supports it in the U.S. and globally, and we see that it's broad, it's in the U.S. national security interest to be more energy independent. It's in our economic interest. It provides, as Secretary Kerry has talked frequently about, the greatest economic opportunities since the Industrial Revolution in terms of this movement towards renewable energy and the jobs it provides and a whole range of other things. But there will be there will undoubtedly be some rollbacks if there's a Trump administration again. And I think, as we saw in the first Trump administration, we have to make sure that every component piece of this is empowered. And so in the way that corporations took the lead, state and local entities took the lead during the Trump years, I think all those other component stakeholders will have to be re-empowered to continue to move this forward and make sure we don't lose this incredibly valuable time at this moment.
All right, absolutely fascinating. We only have about 10 minutes left, and there's a few more questions I wanted to get through on some specific issues, so let's roll through them now. And Rachel, I wanted to ask you about the specifics on the carbon market and carbon pricing here, because at COP, we saw the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, teaming up with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala and Ursula von der Leyen to really make the claim and put a stake in the ground for carbon pricing and putting a price on this and developing a transparent and effective carbon market. Out of COP28, though, we didn't necessarily see significant progress there. I'm wondering why, first of all, and why is it important to put mechanisms like this in place?
So if we don't put a price on the pollution that is causing the problem, we're sort of fighting with one hand, if not two hands, behind our backs. And carbon pricing was a political imperative in the G7 and G20 going into Paris. We have very specific language about the role that carbon markets can play and the direction of all financial flows in the Paris Agreement. And then it suddenly sort of became a technical issue. It's politically difficult. Oh, no, we can't talk about carbon taxes. We can't do carbon fees, whatever. And we've, really that lack of intergovernmental agreement and the lack of speed with which, technically it's Article 6 that refers to carbon markets. The lack of progress there is really hampering things. So companies have got to move through a transition. Companies have got to get to net zero. they're going to need to invest in the technologies and the processes that get them there quickly. They're going to need to be able to access the carbon markets to do that. In the absence of government taking action, then they're wanting to use voluntary carbon markets. Countries are desperate for investment, especially in their adaptation and their resilience. And they desperately would like to have high integrity carbon markets working for them. High integrity because we're way beyond the ability to just sort of, keep on polluting and then just offset. Everybody's got to be on a trajectory down, countries and companies. And then we have to do the math around how that works. So, one of the reasons why I don't think it was an 11 is that the presidency, had to kick Article 6 negotiations to Baku. Not good. And so we see a lot of what I would call sort of unregulated Article 6.2 activity, countries offering to buy offsets from other countries, lack of transparency, no rules around that, no agreed frameworks, which simply feeds into two things. One, a fear, especially by young people, that we're just kicking the can down the road when we don't have time, and this manufactured fear on the far right or the right in populist movements across the world that to get to net zero is somehow going to put a boot on the neck of the small person, right? And so voluntary carbon markets are small. They could get much bigger. They are desperately needed. There's a demand from the corporates and there's a demand from countries, but people need to have confidence that the rules are there. So now, at COP28, we all stood up and said, there's rules now for companies. There's a code of practice that we've put out into the market, which companies are starting to use. There are principles for those who are issuing credits through ICVCM, our sister organization, and now we've got to start using it. And so 2024, despite the fact that governments kicked the negotiations down the road for a year, is a year where we have to put proof into the concept. And it's important we do it. It's important we do it quickly, especially when we've got some difficult elections in November.
Badr, this would be just another burden on business, though, wouldn't it?
Well, it's not about burden. One of the challenges, and really this needs to happen very fast, and it hasn't happened yet, is standardization. Otherwise, everybody's playing to different rule books, and it's chaos, and that needs to happen. And I think business, when rules are clear and they are standardized, business, for the most part, know what they need to follow. And then they can be held accountable and will be, if they're public companies, held accountable by their shareholders for either following those rules or not. So that's critical, and that's something that absolutely has to be pursued. Keeping in mind, again, the COP28 presidency isn't just about the few weeks that happened in Dubai. So there's a lot of work that will be done. In fact, one of the key reasons why Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber himself isn't at Davos is because he's sitting there figuring exactly this aspect out. And yes, I rated it an 11, but the reality is we've got to take that 11 to 1 million, right? And how do we do that? It's exactly what you said, is making sure that we, as the saying goes, vision without implementation is hallucination. So what does that implementation look like across every single one of those action item agendas? There will be a lot that can be done in 11 months, and there'll be a lot of coordination required between 28, 29, and 30 and beyond to make sure we have consistent delivery and not a case of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And that really goes to the question you asked about the politics. Look, I'm a simple businessman, so I wouldn't dare comment on the infinitely complex permutations and combinations of political outcomes. But what I will say, just looking at, and observing recent history, this is part of the problem. You have many governments who come in new and decide as one of their first acts to sort of tear up the policy books and throw them out. And predominantly, I should also add, in Europe and in the US. And that's a killer to a process like COP, which is why to have that continuity and that consistency in delivery, this is where the so-called non-state actors need to come in to make sure that we can deliver and continue on the action agenda, whichever way the political winds are blowing in capitals across the world.
I would just say, I think far from being a burden on companies, again, this is a moment that's all hands on deck. I think you need to try absolutely everything. First of all, obviously companies have to do as much as they can to cut their emissions and decarbonize. But there's going to be some component that they're not going to be able to do without something like offsets. And so for them to do that, they want to make sure that that's done in a credible and legitimate manner and can be trusted. And so the more kind of consistency there is in that, the more legitimacy, the better it is for companies and the more that we actually get achieved. But this is a time that we have to be thinking about everything. That's why I think the IRA is so important. It's why carbon border adjustment mechanisms are so important. It's why the regulatory piece is important. And it's why on renewables, you've got to have everything at the table. It's not just solar and wind, but also hydro and nuclear. And even with all that, we are probably not going to come close enough to 1.5, but we have to keep that alive as the North Star and keep striving, because truly every 10th of a degree you get higher than that, we're in just kind of existential crisis.
And if I may just add to that, so again, in many ways this brings together a lot of what we've been talking about, but a key aspect in terms of making sure that we can move into implementation is making sure that the climate agenda and the human development agenda and the nature agenda are no longer seen as mutually exclusive. Those need to come together, and that's the only way we're going to be building trust in the system and ultimately for the stakeholders that are impacted by this, including, if you take the continent of Africa, the 600 million people in the world who are still to be afforded accessible and affordable energy, who still don't even have electricity. So those agendas need to come together. The nature piece is incredibly important. My wife wouldn't forgive me if I didn't mention that. But as we know, it can take us at least 1/3 of the way towards a 1.5 degree pathway. So we need to, again, find ways to build the nature component into the climate agenda as an additive process and not just seeing it as a zero-sum game or some sort of trade-off between climate, nature, and human development.
Absolutely fascinating. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed the conversation so far. I have one more question for you all, and it's a rapid-fire question as we close out our session here in Davos, Switzerland. The question is, as we come into COP29 in Azerbaijan, what needs to be on the agenda and what can realistically be achieved? Rachel, I'd like to start with you.
Well, what I heard was that carbon funds domiciled in the UAE, as an example, are going to be transparent and adhere to the highest standards of integrity when they do bilateral deals with Liberia and Zambia, which I think is really good, because we need to be able to manage our net zero contributions in partnership, right? So I think that's great. I think that the Azerbaijanis have got a very difficult task, because we do need to have government agreement and we've got to keep up the path. And I think that they're probably going to need a few more women advising them on how to do it. I think it's frankly outrageous, and I mean, it's not a diplomatic mistake, it's outrageous to form an advisory committee for a COP and not have diversity in that. So there you go, Azerbaijan, get your women on your advisory group.
I like it. I like it. Dan, your thoughts?
It will be a challenging COP, I think, for both process reasons and the ability of a country like Azerbaijan to exercise the muscle, show the leadership, and be credible about what they're putting on the table. In terms of the agenda for the COP, I think following up, there's a lot that needs to be done on loss and damage. I think we saw some really good progress on something like the Global Methane Pledge, which will have impact. I would say keep it focused on impact. We have to focus on the implementation. And to that point, it's the actual prep for next year with the 2025 and the new NDCs that's going to be quite important in terms of, again, making sure that we can try to keep 1.5 alive.
Badr.
So it's the elephant in the room, Scope 3 emissions, really. I mean, we've skirted around it for a while, and I think we need to make sure, and this is, again, I believe something that the COP28 presidency itself is going to be really focusing on in the coming months, but it is something that we need to tackle once and for all at a COP. And so I do think that's something that Azerbaijan can sink its teeth into effectively, we hope.
Okay, well, let's hope we get some positive outcomes. We are out of time, so we'll leave it there. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us today. Badr, Dan, and Rachel, please make them feel welcome. We appreciate you being here as well.
Debate, and I wholeheartedly agree with your final comments. I completely agree. It's fantastic to see you on the panel. If nothing else, a big round of applause, please, for our fantastic panelists. And thank you to you too.
Thank you
again. It's a pleasure to see you. Thank you very much. We'll come back and see us in the sanctuary. I hope you do.
We'll do it.
Yeah, please do. Thank you. If you can take a seat down there, that would be great. Now, my lovely team just have let me know that the video that we played at the beginning had a couple of technical errors when it came to audio. So what we'd like to do is just play that again very quickly. before, I've just been told I don't need to say that, but honesty, transparency, that's the name of the game these days. So let's play it again before I welcome up our next guests.
What if they said phase out of abated fossil fuels? That would be the wrong scenario?
Part of the thing that slowed us down is this focus on making a step change and getting out of our existing energy system and starting something brand new. That is going to be a long, costly process.
63% of our emissions right now are from oil and gas. That's an awful lot of emissions, and if we're going to be serious about reducing those emissions at the scale we need to, we all need to step up.
Facilitating the speed of innovation and the speed of the scale up, that's my big hope for COP28.
Every decision we make should be geared to say, does this advance the 1.5 degrees, or is it going to be more destructive and take us in the wrong direction?
How do you make big polluters pay for the carbon emissions that they emit?
Without carbon price, it won't happen fast enough. Create the transparency of the paradigm on reporting on how good looks like in terms of the path to carbon neutrality, walking the talk and showing that we're moving.
You heard it then, and it was a fantastic set of ideas and voices we heard there. We're going to continue that theme now with the Sustainable Future Forum. You saw Tanya very quickly in that video, and she graces us with her presence now. It gives me great pleasure to welcome back and say hi to the stage, CNBC's host and executive producer, Tanya Bright. It's nice to see you. How are you? Big round of applause. I've not seen you yet.
I know.
How's it going?
It's going very
Good?
well. Thank you so much, and welcome everyone. And we're so pleased you're here as part of our Sustainable Future Forum. Emma, thank you so much for introducing me, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce my next guest, because this year marks 25 years since the UN Global Compact was proposed by the then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. And now, please welcome Sanda Ojiambo, CEO and Executive Director of the UN Global Compact. Sanda. Thank you. Well, Sanda, first of all, thank you so much for being part of our Sustainable Future Forum. And 25 years since UN Global Compact was established, what have you seen as the most progress?
Well, thank you. I mean, and thank you to all of you for taking the time. I think it's a real inflection point, 25 years, because you sort of look at what was the promise that Kofi Annan set out 25 years ago. Yes. And what he did say, it was right here in Davos, February 1, 1999, that it was important to create a compact between business and the world, essentially, that brought in values and principles to shape the way business would do business. You know, I thought 25 years on, we certainly are the largest corporate sustainability initiative. We are seeing bold leadership. We are seeing principled business. We're not, you know, there's always the opportunity to have more business members. But what I see and what I see about progress, and I'm hearing that more and more at forums like Davos, at UN convenings, is that business is being called to the table to help solve problems, not just do business. And for me, I think that is really what Kofi Annan said and meant when he said we have to bring a human face to the global market. It's great to see business leaders want to take on the challenges of the world.
Well, of course, the theme this year at Davos is rebuilding trust. Is that possible, Sanda, from where you're sitting?
Look, I think we have to live in optimism and hope. Literally, the fragmentation that we see in this world, and we sat here a year ago at the cusp of what we thought were big problems. It's only gotten more complex, you know. We still have a myriad of current and forgotten wars. We're still dealing with inflation. We're still dealing with the adverse outcomes of the COVID pandemic that still split the world. We're seeing lots of fractures, let alone fractures with institutions and lack of trust amongst people. So we have to be able to rebuild. But I want to pick on something interesting I heard from a young person yesterday who said it's not about rebuilding trust. We literally have to build trust. There's a generation who've grown up knowing a world in fracture. And we need to understand that they see the world very differently from where we sit.
Future of responsible business, what do you think that looks like?
Right. I do think more than ever, business doesn't need to be at the table to solve problems. I see the future of responsible business being one more of a future of multi-stakeholder problem solving. Business is not, I think, a parallel track. Business is a huge solution provider. innovation, scale, speed to market, investment finance. So the future for responsible business for me is one where business does great business, but business also helps solve for societal challenges and some of these big issues. To be able to do that, though, I think, and this is a call to governments that we started, putting out there, is that there needs to be that level playing field, that predictability, a regulatory environment that allows business to thrive. Because without that, we won't get the best of the private sector.
You're having conversations here at the forum. What are you hearing? What are the main challenges that business leaders are telling you about?
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, let me reflect on a couple of things that I've heard this morning. I sat in on a morning session with Bill Gates, and he talked about the fact that innovation abounds. I mean, he was showing some very simple yet impactful solutions that are saving women's lives and children's lives around the world. No shortage of innovation, but delivery is where the challenge is. So perhaps delivery systems are fractured. There's not enough investment going to scale and scope. But also in this world of mistrust and broken systems, we will not be able to deliver life-saving technology for mothers and girls. We will not be able to deliver education. So I think, it's one of those about we need an infrastructure that will allow for solution delivery. That was the first. I think a second thing was really looking at the Edelman Trust Survey. And trust in institutions, all institutions around the world has dropped. But what was the major risk right now? It was misinformation and disinformation. It's not the climate crisis, it's not inflation, it's not pandemic anymore. People we don't trust information. Science is being questioned, institutions are being questioned, information is being questioned, conversations are being questioned. That is a pretty low trust environment. And I think that is something that we're going to really have to overcome now more than ever, and really get facts on the table and be able to really look at how media and the question of mis and disinformation is addressed. It's absolutely critical. It's a year when we were talking about that, 40, 50 elections around the world. That's not a great environment for misinformation and disinformation to thrive.
How do you think businesses can overcome this challenge? What advice are you giving from the UN Global Compact?
Well, a couple of pieces, and I think where do we use information in giving facts and credence to the principles that we stand by. If you look at the climate crisis, we're very clear that to be able to keep 1.5 alive, to get to our goals for 2030, it does need to be credible, pathways need to be verifiable and accountable. Science is important. Science will govern how we get to keep 1.5 alive. And for us, I think it's just really to stick to the facts. There is a climate crisis, and we do need to address it in certain pathways. I think other bits of information, disinformation, there's a lot of work that's going on around technology, AI, large language models, and other pieces. And I think it's just really important to see how this is governed. I see lots of opportunity in AI and tech. I really do. I think we just need to look at the governance of it and make sure that it's used in ways that are ethical, non-biased, and that will give benefits to populations at large.
What about the SDGs, Sandra? Out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN, only 15% are on track to be delivered by 2030.
Yeah, that was a really sobering call from our SDG summit in September last year. I don't think when the goals were set in 2015, we had expected, well, no one had expected the challenges that we saw. I call them the 4 C's, easy to remember. The COVID pandemic, the climate crisis, conflict, and the cost of capital. All of those 4 have set the world back in tremendous ways. North, south, east, west, large company, small company, we've all suffered. And so have the SDGs, right? So we did the stock take, only 15% of the goals are on track. There's also great different ways to look at it. We have 7.5 years to see what we can do to make up on that, but there have been tremendous losses. There's no doubt about that. I think what we need to do and do differently is just really ramp up our momentum. Private sector needs to continue with the innovation, the great work that's happening, but be at the table. So governments need to create that space for this true public-private dialogue. Look at the SDGs as a North Star, as an investment opportunity for businesses, and see how we get there, because we do have 7.5 years to try and make it right.
How do you get that kind of collaboration between the public-private sector? How do you persuade governments to actually act? I mean, of course, we had COP28. Everyone was talking about the pledges that came out of there. Is enough being done, do you think, Sandra?
You know, one of the really exciting things about COP, and you know, right after COP, there was actually a conference on anti-corruption that was held in Atlanta, is that there's a lot of momentum that happens alongside the governmental discussions. Anyone who was at COP saw the energy of, you know, what we broadly call the non-state actors. It was private sector, it was civil society, and others. Lots of innovation, lots of momentum, lots of coalition-driven agreements. Now, what we need more, and I'll talk about this in the context of COP, really is that when governments are forming their, you know, their nationally determined contributions, that there truly is strong synergy with private sector, and there must be for the NDCs to be real and realistic. I do think it's important to keep the momentum on the commitments that the private sector is making. I talked about science and evidence. In many instances, I hear CEOs saying, but look, we're far ahead of our government's ambition. We want to go further. We want to go faster. And that's why I really think this public-private dialogue is so important right now. I mean, business is a true partner to help governments accelerate. And now more than ever, I don't think there's any government that sees its success without the private sector being a key part of it. So we really must be able to create more and more of that dialogue. But I continue to stress that there has to be the enabling environment for business to be able to thrive.
What do you say to businesses that are not signed up to the UN Global Compact?
There's a lot to say, but I'll start with sign up. Look, you know, what I'll say is that what does the Global Compact provide? It provides a great platform for businesses and business leaders, first to raise that global ambition, to sort of take a stand for bold leadership and reset ambition for the private sector. The second also, and this is perhaps for more nascent businesses, for SMEs, we're a great place that provides tools, guidance, reporting, reporting advisory, as well as really the opportunity, I think, to connect to what is the largest sustainability initiative in the world.
I want to talk to you about gender equality because there's a staggering statistic here from the World Economic Forum that we talk about every year, but it doesn't get any shorter. 131 years before we can get gender parity. What is the UN Global Compact doing to help close the gap? For women in business?
Look, it continues to be such a sobering statistic, but I also want to take a step back and look at it in a different way because, you know, there was a conversation I had earlier today about who's shaping the agenda for COP and what does the political leadership look like. And it's primarily mainly male. And I think that is a question. I think a lot of the systems within which we operate are not gender balanced to begin with, right? And thus, therefore, we end up with systems that don't advance what women need, you know, in terms of resources, equity, access, opportunity. So I think we need to take a really systemic look at what we are doing to advance gender and gender parity and equality. Some of the things that you've talked about, why it'll take 131 years, actually even start in the household. In some places and some communities, there's a low valuation of girls and women. They don't get to fulfill their educational opportunities. They don't get the chance to get decent jobs and work. Some get into early child marriage, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a communal approach there. I think then we look at what happens in the workplace and the types of biases, and we see that so many times on the news. The biases, the discrimination that women face in the workplace, the biases that keep women out of professions, you know, science, technology, or others, the biases that keep women out of political leadership. Yeah. And what can then we do as you know, system leaders, thinkers, transformers, to be able to bring women into at the table when all these important things are happening? I think it's a real systemic response. There's not anything that one institution can do, but I think we need to really question the low valuation that we are putting on girls and women right now. You know, there's just no reason to not value half of the population.
Absolutely. And as the CEO and Executive Director of the Global Compact, how do you ensure your teams are forming strategic partnerships required to make change at local and global levels?
You know, now more than ever, it is so clear that no one organization, no one entity is going to be able to, you know, make a dent in all the challenges we face. So we're very keen to be at places such as WEF, to be at other convenings, and partner with businesses, with other entities, with WEF in and of itself to drive the agenda forward. I think this is not the time for competition on anything, even in business. You know, I think we need more radical collaboration. We need to have sort of a very driven solution finding mind at hand to be able to get there. This is definitely not the time to compete. The crisis, the poly crisis is really at us.
What has your message been and what will it be to leaders here at Davos?
Well, look, trust is the overarching theme here, and I do think there's a true opportunity to look at building and rebuilding trust. Trust amongst individuals, I think, is at an all-time low. Trust in political systems remains a critical issue. Trust in information, and we talked about the misinformation is a really big issue. So if we could leave Davos, one, I think having forged an understanding that what we need is a more collaborative world, and then see trust as a great platform to be able to deliver solutions, I think we're in a better place. It's a truly important year, 2024, the 50 elections that are coming up, the fact that information and disinformation is threatening what the world looks like, the very fact that really we have generations that are coming to being that haven't seen a world that is at ease, I think is really, really important. For the Global Compact, as I said, hitting our 25-year anniversary, I think what's really important in our inflection point is really looking at how we can bring more businesses at the table to address these critical policy barriers to doing good business. There's a couple of critical issues and opportunities in the climate transition, in the energy transition, in food systems, in digital, and in skilling the next generation that is really, really important to us. So we're going to focus on these. We're focusing on issues such as living wage, because right now, I think the economic situation in many economies is such that those at the foundational level are at the cusp of really driving social unrest. And private sector really needs to look very critically at not just minimum wages, but living wages for society.
Sandra, just finally talking about the climate crisis, were you happy with the pledges from COP28, and how do you feel the UN can actually support that going forward into action?
So it was a difficult COP, because to see the ongoing friction around fossil fuels and the phase out and the debate between phasing out and phasing down just really demonstrated that there's still a lot of tension points around it. We eventually got there, but it took a while. And I think what's really important is to also make sure that all of the financial commitments are truly honored. It's really disheartening to see countries, low-income countries, the small island developing states literally sink under the weight of the climate crisis. Absolutely important. Underpinning it all, or overarching all of it, is the need to keep the 1.5 alive. I think that's it. But I just want to end on the climate piece by reflecting on, it's not simply addressing climate for climate's sake. At the heart of it are humans, the human population, our planet. We need to be sure that we can actually keep ourselves alive, and that's why addressing the climate crisis is absolutely important.
Sandra Jambo, thank you so much for joining me today at our Sustainable Future Forum. Sandra Jambo, everyone, thank you so much. Thank you. They're wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And please stay exactly where you are for our next panel. Sandra?
And thank you, Tanya. Always so good to see you, darling.
Wonderful to see you.
Okay, so I will be back with you now till the end of the day. I'm sitting here at the Filecoin Sanctuary. Everyone looks like they're looking too much at their phones, so let's do a quick temperature check. My boss of events at CNBC is sitting right there. So has everyone been enjoying the day today? Yeah? Okay, great. Fantastic. Okay, so just to let you know, we have, of course, 2 more days of packed events. And if you want to register, you can do so just over there at the entrance where you do the coat check, or you can also go online. You can pre-register at cnbcevents.com/WEF 2024. So please do that as well if you want to pre-register. And of course, bring all of your friends as well. Now, the last conference, as everyone sort of puts the chairs together, our conversation in the Sustainable Future Forum looks at navigating the energy transition. Now, of course, we've seen the fallout from the Ukraine war. It put a really spotlight on energy security. So where are we with that? Well, it's my pleasure then to invite to the stage Steve Sedgwick. He's the co-anchor of CNBC's flagship show, Squawk Box. Steve, over to you.
I'm busking now. As usual with my job, we're short of a microphone. Apparently someone's walked off one. Someone is in Davos with a microphone. And everything they're saying we can hear, so maybe we should put their microphone up. But I've been covering energy for my entire career at CNBC, pretty much, which is over 20 years. I had the pleasure of getting the OPEC beat in the early noughties, and I've had the amazing pleasure of seeing the stunning development from Kyoto as a nice idea, but actually very little in action. And then I moved on to what I think was the pivotal event for many of us, which was the Paris Agreement, where I was at Le Bourget in Paris at the tail end of 2015. Then, just to spin forward a few years, I was in Glasgow for COP26, and I've just come back from Dubai for COP28, where some of our amazing panel, who are going to come up here now anyway, and I'll just let them go and come and sit down, were also with me as well. And I'm really hoping that what we can really learn from this panel, which is being streamed on two places, it's YouTube and Facebook. There you go. I was going to say all other kinds of social media, but those are the two that are important. I'm really hoping that we can establish that something has happened at COP28. I mean, Dr. Sultan is a man that many of us know, many of us have worked with. He's a very tough businessman. He came in for a lot of stick for being an oil man. He was part of ADNOC as well, and he really bristled at that. And I can be fairly discreet in telling you that when I went to an oil conference before the COP28, I went to something called ADIPEC, which is one of the world's largest oil conferences. He was bristling and saying to me, I am not just an oil man, I will get things done. And that's what I'm really hoping we can learn from this panel, that actually there is renewed momentum in the transition to net zero. I hope I'm going to hear that, but I've got this stunning panel. Some of these are old friends, some of them are very new friends as well. And I'm really hoping that we can learn a little bit about the speed of transition and just a little bit of a recap of what the barriers are and how we can move ahead as well. In no particular order, we have, in fact, I'll start off at the end there. Badr is someone I've just had the pleasure of meeting. He's the CEO of Rio Tinto Copper. And what is amazing about this company is, hang on, Rio Tinto is a miner. Rio Tinto is one of the pivotal companies because they're investing in copper, they're investing in the key materials needed for the energy transition as well. So we're going to get a really good view on that as well. And I know he's got a holistic view of what's going on as well. Marco Avella is a man I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years. He's the CEO of TES as well. I've even read his book, and there aren't many businessmen and women, I can tell you, whose book I can honestly say I've actually read. I've read bits of many of theirs, and I have to say that to them, but very few I've read the whole thing, because it's actually a great guide to the world of hydrogen. I would thoroughly recommend it if, and I don't want to give you extra revenues, but I would thoroughly recommend it if indeed you want to know a primer and then go into a deep dive on hydrogen.
Thanks a lot.
You are a great champion of that, and it has been amazing. And I've learned all about the rainbow of hydrogen. Next is a brand new friend, Vaishali Sina, who is the co-founder of Renew. I've had the pleasure of meeting your husband before as well on panels, and I know you've got an amazing view on what the whole world needs to do for its transition, not just for some of these rich Western nations who are saying how we can move ahead on one model, because there's not going to be one size fits all as well. A great friend is Henrik Andersen, the CEO of Vestas as well. You all know Vestas, pivotal company in terms of the transition as far as wind is concerned. We'll move on that. I've actually got the pleasure of speaking tomorrow morning on Squawk Box as well. And of course, Alfred Stern as well. OMV, well, he says we're one of the smaller oil and gas companies, but you're an integrated company and you do absolutely everything from extraction to servicing the consumer as well. So again, fascinating insight as well. So why don't I just ask that very generic question, which I put to our live stream audience and to you as well, is have we made renewed progress since COP28? Was it pivotal, or was it just jawboning and very little new happened as well in the key years? We're already coming towards the middle of this pivotal decade. Have we made real progress? And I'm going to make no bones about it, because I've spoken to these three gentlemen before. I'm going to start off with you, Vaishali, and I just want to know your view, and then I'm going to go to Bold, I'm going to get you, then I'm going to move along, and then we'll move on from there. So just tell me, do you think anything amazing happened out of COP28, or was it just business as usual?
You know, sometimes I feel that business as usual is good business, and it's amazing, because I think that's what we need to be able to keep doing things which are important. And I think events like COP and Davos, etc., brings together leaders, the private sector, the civil society, to come together and agree on targets and agree on a plan to work together. I think this COP was particularly useful, and given that I am from the renewable energy space, that to agree on tripling renewables was, in my view, one of the best outcomes from COP28.
We have some incredible champions of various renewable products here as well. We also have a representative from an oil and gas company that's moving to a huge amount of investment into renewables. But did you feel that actually the inclusion of the big oil players, was it a positive move or was it a negative move?
I think it was a very positive move. I'm not sure if we can make any progress without having an inclusive approach towards our journey here.
Yeah.
And we have to include the oil and gas to transition. What I'd like to see them do more is, I think the oil and gas companies have only invested about 1% in the renewables area or in the mitigation area last year, just to look at data and a statistic. I think we can do more. I think the contribution for them to pivot from oil and gas and to get into other areas, whether it's in terms of investments, whether it is partnerships, is a lot more. I think we really need to monitor the acceleration in getting engaged and at some point perhaps put an end to the emission-oriented materials.
As is my want, I'm going to change the order straight away because you've piqued my interest, and that which means, Bold, just hang on a second. I'm going to go straight to the oil and gas representative as well. You are Mr. Oil and Gas Industry. I know that that's a cruel thing to label you, but that's a good point, isn't it? As an industry, it hasn't invested enough. I know that actually OMV is investing in a hell of a lot of money.
So at OMV, we actually have a strategy which is going to make us net zero by 2050 in all three scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3, right? Oh. And for that, we have to invest quite massively in order to make that transformation. But I like to talk about a responsible transformation, which means actually that we need to make sure that we provide the energies of today and invest heavily in new energies so that we can make that with less emissions, right? And I think that's really important. And for me in COP28, it was a pivotal point, right? Because we all know what we need to do. I think we all know the problem statement, but it is all about operationalizing it. And I'm not so much into wordsmithing, but when you look at some of the outcomes of COP28, I think the UAE has done a fantastic job to bring people together, make it more inclusive, and in particular, look at some of the finance elements, loss and damage, where there was actual contributions of 800 million, right? Contributions to financing of the green transformation. But for me, the most important thing was this global decarbonization accelerator that was launched, where OMV also signed up to, where a huge amount of NOCs and IOCs signed up to actually become net zero, scope 1 and 2 by 2050, but to become near zero emissions of methane. And methane is a huge contributor to climate warming. Now, is this all enough? Of course it's not enough. But a lot of these companies, they were not looking at that subject at all. Now they signed up, and collectively we have committed to tripling renewable capacity by 2030 and doubling energy efficiency. So now it's in operational, and I completely agree with you, right? It does require the big companies to have the financial power to invest, but also the operational capability to make these investment projects happen.
I'll come to the representative of hydrogen and wind in a few moments' time, but Bold, as I say, we need the materials to be in place. Now, when I look at various materials for the energy transition, I see some wild prices. Rio Tinto has to look through that, has to look through the short-term volatility, whether it's copper, whether it's other products out there. I look at cobalt and lithium and I see the incredible volatility as well. Difficult to do, but you know you've got a job to do in order to provide the materials for the energy transition.
Yeah, I think one of our biggest challenges of the industry is nobody likes mining, especially in their backyard. And it makes it particularly difficult because without mining, we cannot have the energy transition. Everything you see around you is either grown or mined. The steel and the copper comes from somewhere. So when you look at the plumbing in your house, that's has to come from somewhere. And the circularity and the recycling only provides 20% of the materials. So we're just gonna have to consume 80% less of everything if we wanted to rely on recycling. So one of the biggest challenges for mining is how do we get social license and trust, in particular around the communities who want to benefit also from the energy transition. And in many respects, we forgot in the West that mining has built San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles, Salt Lake, and you look about, Denver Nuggets and, all these names, they are the old mining names.
Yeah.
And I think the, developing world wants to benefit from mining, but also jump in its development. So I think the key challenge for a mining company like ours is, first and foremost, we have to work local with the communities that surround the mines. If we have the support, then we can find the engineering and the government permitting. But the community trust is essential for this transition.
I'm just going to be a little bit of a schoolmaster here. I can hear a little bit of chatter at the back. I don't know who it is. If I could just have you pipe down a little bit. Sorry, that's me being a bit bossy. That's my views, not CNBC's, or get in trouble. But absolutely. But why historically have there been so many problems in bringing population, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's mining industry as well? There's been some huge mistakes made. We talk about climate in this panel. We talk about transitions panel. But are the miners cleaning up their act on ESG?
100% Rio Tinto. We are absolutely not perfect. We made our mistakes. And what we need to do better is to make sure that we listen to opposing voices, because they usually have a pretty constructive feedback on where to put the mine. And when we go around social surrounds and assess historical heritage sites, if the local community says there's a burial site of my ancestors, well, we cannot mine there.
Yeah.
And we have to find a solution where we work with the community and co-design and co-develop what is the best way. Because most of the time the communities actually support development, but they don't want to, of course, it comes at a huge price of their societal history.
Let me get back to the same question. I'll first Marco and then Henrik as well. Was it pivotal for you?
For us, it was because we signed a deal with Sultan and with ADNOC right during COP. So there's a lot of concern about the association with business and COP and using COP for business. But actually the number one, and like you have been 20 years in the industry going to many COPs, the number one challenge with the COPs is just a lack of progress on business. So any business deal that is green is good. There's not enough steel being put on the ground or copper being mined and put in the ground. So that's really where we need to make progress. I mean, Alfred was very clear in the benefit of the methane alliance. The industry's been working on this for a while, so I think that's really good. But also to be bringing together these opposing views. You have the climate Talibans on the one hand that want to just electrify everything immediately, and it's all about just getting those 100% to electric vehicles very soon. And then you have the kind of climate deniers or the climate skeptics.
You call the first lot climate Taliban.
You have some kind of extreme versions of, we won't accept anything that is not like 100% electricity-driven industry. And many heavy industries cannot be electrified. So I think what this COP did is it brought together, instead of increasing the polarization at a time when we have extremisms, we have 40% of people going in elections this year. Climate fatigue is the biggest risk to the energy transition.
Yeah.
Climate fatigue is enhanced by interest rates, by the war that drove energy prices really high, by inflation that is driving the cost of renewables higher. So climate fatigue, I think, needs to be addressed with collaboration and with real projects to show that there are some low-hanging fruits there, some technologies there that are in the money already. So when I see Texas and Saudi Arabia, the two kind of oil-rich producing states, being the biggest investors in renewables, that's when I know the energy transition is happening.
And look, as you quite rightly say, there are some people in the climate movement. I spoke to Greta Thunberg here in this very building a year ago. She will never speak to Darren Woods, and Darren Woods perhaps will never speak to Greta Thunberg. But the fact is that certain people, whether they are trying to push very aggressively or those who are just going at their own steady pace, or they think there's a different route to market as well, to get them all in the dialogue is stunningly important. That's what I thought was really pivotal. The fact that for the first COP ever, I spoke to Darren Woods. I can speak to Henrik at a COP because I know that he and his predecessors will always be there because they are pushing very hard for more renewables as well. Did you get anything out of COP that felt more than lip service?
I think it's the states. It's the states on a longer journey, and I think COP28. I always I belong to private sector. I live my life with facts. I always say if you want to triple something to the year of 2030, you just need to just take a step back. And if you want to triple something, that means that you come a long way. You only have 6 more years. And that means we are already now 2 weeks into the next year. Yeah. And it's a cumulative statement you just made. That means if you are, sorry to say, coming back to the mining and other stuff, if you now have another 24 or 36 months of permitting vacuum or backlog, then you will actually just come close. And I don't like to be the one that sort of spoils Christmas 11 and a half months before, but then you are not going to achieve your tripling a renewable target in just 7 years. So I think it's also a ground zero. Let's get down here. This is what it's about. The year of 2024, I encourage everyone to say that it has to be the year of action. Yep. We published a bit earlier yesterday, we published on the blog, which just says it needs to have a complete reset of how we think on permitting and auction, because otherwise there's not a chance. I'm positive. I have 2 daughters, and they always ask me to get something done of this, because if we are not, we are leaving something in 2030. We know we had the tools, but we cannot do the energy transition and run the risk of destabilizing societies. And what do I mean by that? My good friend here, I had to order booked, so he might want to buy something in the middle of this, or in the end. But in reality here, every time we withdraw something, we need to make sure we have it in position, because otherwise, when you switch the socket on, it doesn't come out with the electricity we need. Yeah. And that whole, if we look around us, I love this. 4 years ago, walked down the middle road here, there wasn't an electric car in Davos for that whole week. Now, half and half, right? But in the homes back home, you also see now that everyone that changes from gas or oil, for that matter, goes into electric heating pumps. Mm-hmm. It just requires a lot more electricity.
So we've created the demand.
We have.
But we just don't have enough supply at the moment. Is that what and by the way, after this question to Henrik, it's open season for all of you. If you hear anything you want to jump in, just let me know and just get in as well. So Henrik, it's the same concern that I hear from you year in, year out, and I've heard from your predecessors as well, is the permitting. Why are governments acting so quickly when it comes to getting their LNG terminals, but so slow when it comes to getting their permitting for wind?
I think there's 2 things. First of all, we live a little bit in a decade ago where it probably has to be subsidized, and that means you both had to find a financial subsidy argument, and you had to find maybe it disturbs local societies. Mm-hmm. If we look at it today, the cost of electricity coming from renewable is competitive. It's competitive to the market price, and that means you have won the first battle, because it means you don't have to compensate. And secondly, which we can also see, I think here's one good thing with both social media and the things going on in local societies. People generally have flipped from being 2/3 against and 1/3 for, to now having 2/3 for, as long as they can also be part of it. And that's a change that has happened in the last 5 or 7 years. And I think that gives me a lot of belief that this is actually happening.
What does that mean, be part of it? Sorry, I know you both want to come in. What does that mean, be part of it?
Because you now have that the local sets also their own rule. And I think I see a lot of that around in our more than 80 countries, where you get a part of the payment of permitting locally gets into the sustainability fund of either municipalities or whatever.
Which comes back to the same as mining. You have to empower local people, local populations, in order to feel part of it as well. I'll go with Alfred, then Vasheli's going to come in.
Yeah, I want to build a little bit on this, because I think what is different on the LNG terminals to some other things, I think crises are great accelerators. And this is what we had, and this is what enabled us to move fast. And I think we need to come to more of a realization that both maybe from a global competition, but also from a climate change perspective, we do have a crisis, and we need to shortcut some of these things, right? That does and power. But I want to say a little bit something about OMV, right? Because we are investing about 3.5 billion euros per year up until 2030 to make our transformation. And 40% of that, so 1.5 billion per year, will go into sustainable investments. And when I say responsible transformation, I'm completely with you. You need to replace with something else, right? So what we do is we supply gas today so that people can heat their homes. Tomorrow, and we have active development going on this, we will supply geothermal energy, right? So we will start heating Vienna together with the district heating provider that has 400,000 households on there with geothermal heat. We are drilling down 3,000 meters. We are using our geological know-how, how to drill, how to operate those things in order to provide the heat. This will allow to be more efficient than individual heat exchangers. So we will use less energy, less electricity for this. But this needs to be developed, right? It will take some time to develop for the first 20,000 households, and then in a few years from now, we'll supply 200,000 households.
It can be done. Look what our friends in Iceland have done, albeit with a special geographic and geothermal conditions as well. Charlie.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, we all have to look beyond ourselves in this transition. It's about, one world, one transition, one goal. And whether it is minerals, I think minerals are concentrated in certain geographies, but we all need them, and we all need them in a way which is accessible, which is affordable. And how do we work together to make that happen? Just going back to your point on COP, I think what I've seen on the ground, especially in India, that the COPs are now not only about governments, it's about national governments, subnational governments, private sector. So when they come back home, and when we get down to doing business, I think they're very sensitized and we have common goals. So we've seen some agility around the regulations which are required to solve for issues like, how do we transition from coal to clean? How do we triple? And we are very engaged in those conversations, which I believe is important to accelerate the transition not only in countries, but across, as I think the national governments have become super ambitious because there is this competition globally to do more and to do better.
Just need them to move from being very competitive in increasing targets to actually becoming
doing more on the ground. I agree with that.
As I said, I've given a couple of big hogs because if you take a Robert Habeck from Germany, he's gone from literally zero permitting in onshore wind to now doing 3.5 gigawatt. That deserves a hog. And I think it also gives a little bit of this sense of it can actually be done. You need to activate your local states and your local municipalities. And without that, we won't have the hydrogen, or we won't do the hard bit with the industrial sector either. So I think I love the competition of increasing targets, but I also like the sense in the lab and saying, can it then be done?
I mean, I just wanted to maybe just share a few numbers. So 7 billion people on Earth, our total car park fleet is 1 billion, and our annual total sales is about 100 million. So at the moment, electric vehicle penetration by 2030 or 35, depending who you ask, will be either 40 to 50%. Every electric vehicle has now 60 kilograms of copper.
Wow.
Where in the past, the internal combustion engine vehicle had only 15 kilograms of copper. So every electric vehicle is quadrupling its copper intensity and consumption. And then you talk about the charging stations, you talk about renewables, you're talking about how to connect the solar and the wind, and it's a massive supply shortage. And the biggest impediment to our development in addressing and increasing the supply is what we talked about, permitting. And permitting is a political electoral cycle of inaction. So if the government has no timeline, it's much better for them not to make any decision rather than lose votes. So the key question is, how do you create a permitting process that is not sequential, that is transparent, that moves in parallel, has the same stringent standards, public consultation process, but then it has a deadline. Within X number of months, 18 months or 24 months, it's finished. Then the business can make a decision, yes or no. This project is dead and we can go move on. But because it drags out for 10 to 15 years, it's impossible to address the supply shortage. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges is how do you hold governments to account by having very specific measurable KPIs and deadlines?
Yeah, and let's be honest about it. No one's going to win an election by saying we've increased our copper mining in your area.
100%.
It's 100% a problem.
But also picking up just a little bit, because we always take that as the demand side, and this is the other thing which is playing a little bit with your number is what we also then shouldn't underestimate. Then suddenly we have fantastic global storage opportunity parked in all our drives. You also just need that little inverter. So at one point in time, that means the renewable industry doesn't have any of this, oh, well, what about if the sun is not out tomorrow? What about if the wind doesn't blow? Because in reality, then you would have a rather large storage thing that could also empower your own household back there. And the good thing with your copper, our copper in the turbines and the copper in the cars and other stuff, we can start recycling it. So yes, there is a ramp up now, but the recyclability of what we
still not enough.
I'll come back to the circular economy.
But that's why you have a business. So I'm a customer of yours. So that's fantastic.
Oh, that's lovely, isn't it? I knew the deals would get done in Davos. I'll come back to the circular economy with Alfred in a few moments' time. Mark,
no, I think Bol at the beginning said something really important. You just can't mine where the local people don't want you to mine. So I think when we talk about permitting, there's kind of the red tape part of it, which should be cut. But there's also the NIMBY part, which is much harder to deal with because you somehow need to engage with them. And that's where I think that molecules and hydrogen can play a big role. Because let's be very clear, and I think this COP is making it clear, has made it clear. Wherever there's a lot of sun and wind, you can make electrons cheaper than the electrons you can make from fossil fuels. So the global average price for electricity is about $110 a megawatt hour, and the cheapest wind and the cheapest solar are kind of below 30. So that has to be the starting point for the discussion. The second point is we can certainly increase the penetration of EVs, and we will. Electricity is now 20% of the energy mix. 77% is fossil fuels. That share will go up to maybe 50, maybe 55, maybe 45, we don't know. But that's the order of magnitude. So you still need about 45 or 50% of green molecules. And those are going to be, half of those are going to be synthetic, so hydrogen-based, and half of those are going to be biofuels or other things like that. So so if we take that optimistic view that we can make cheaper energy today, then we can solve a lot of the permitting issues by putting the panels where it's sunny and the turbines where it's windy, where you have a lot of land. And then moving that energy either by converting it into hydrogen or by building electric cables over long distances. And if you look at the telecom, Google has 20 cables going across the ocean. We'll have the same for electricity. We'll be able to play the spreads between different time zones, between different weather patterns. And as we interconnect the world, we can make it a lot more efficient because there's still a lot of inefficiency in the way
I've been talking about better grids for a long time. Obviously not transatlantic necessarily, but better grids, better transfer of that power. Again, it's a pivotal part that we talked about a long time. Henrik, did you want to come in?
No, I'm just saying here, I fully agree. And I think it creates jobs, it creates a future. And even the better thing is, and as we are doing that, we're seeing it, you got carbon-reduced steel already, and there's a lot more to be had of that. So you are now into that there are evidence it can be done. Now it's about getting it, and as you're rightly saying, hydrogen is probably not the most efficient thing to transport as such, so therefore, how do we get it in closer to where it's produced, to get it into the product we then can transport, whether it's ammonia, whether it goes into green methanol or it goes into steel.
ENG, electric natural gas.
Yeah,
that's what we do.
But as I said, it's right up that alley, and that's where, come on, the technology now runs and the demand side runs, and what I'm really encouraged with, it's a little bit back to your point, the electric car is a no-brainer. It's happening because the private consumer takes that decision.
Just need to improve the supply of product, though. So we're not running on the wrong kind of electricity.
Sure, but that also means the politician's job today is no longer to inspire people to make the decision. That's happening. The politician's job is now to meet demand and supply in also making either the permitting or, even worse, avoid the blackouts. Because if we are not clever in electric balancing, we end up having parts of the world, parts of states, where it's blackouts.
Did you want to come in a bit on the circular economy as well? Because we talked a little about recycling of copper. I know that the circular economy is something you're working quite important.
I think it's a good time to come in. You talked about it, and I think it's really important to keep this in mind. At OMV, we are focused with circular economy on recycling plastic, basically, right? And when we supply today chemicals, plastics that are made from fossil feedstock, we will tomorrow supply the same things that are made from garbage, essentially, right? And in order to do that, we have just commissioned a plant together with our partner in Germany, Interzero, to build Germany's, not Europe's actually, biggest sorting plant that will sort out about over 200,000 tons of plastics and create the feedstock for our ReOil plant, which is our chemical recycling technology, and separate then basically put it back into the building blocks that we can start chemistry from anew. Why is this good? This is good because it avoids garbage, right, landfill. But on the other side, it's also significantly more energy efficient than starting from fossil, right? And that brings down energy consumption and allows us to close the loop.
There's just on circularity, there's something really neat, and I think Saudi Arabia has been pushing this, a circular carbon economy. When you look at CO2, it's really bad if it goes in the atmosphere, but it's really useful as a carrier of hydrogen. So we've discovered that by combining CO2 and hydrogen, you create synthetic methane. That way you've cracked the hydrogen issues. You no longer have to change any of the backbones, any of the burners, any of the factories, and you can recycle that CO2. So I can sell it to Alfred in one of his power plants. He gives me back the CO2, and it carries the hydrogen all the way from Texas or North Africa into the power plant. So there's a lot of benefit in circularity, also of CO2.
I do want to move on just slightly, because we've got a few minutes left. I want to talk about the financing side of things and how that's changed and whether the capital is available. I keep getting told by a lot of people that we have better databases for evaluating investments in renewables now, for evaluating which companies are making the best moves into renewables and the transition as well. How does the capital situation feel like to you 5 individuals looking for capital for new projects as well? Why don't I start with you, Charlotte, as well?
Sure.
Is the money available for the right projects, or actually is it just still very difficult to come by?
Yeah, no, capital is critical. Obviously, this last year has been quite difficult with the interest rates being where they are. But on the private finance side, private equity side, as far as India is concerned, we've seen a huge amount of growth in private capital coming into the renewables energy space. I think the one area where I've not seen a lot happening is, while there are green bonds, etc., but in terms of the interest rate benefit or the cost of financing, it's not been any better than an average bond. It's just a lot of dressing up and, you know, kind of as opposed to real benefits, given that...
But I'll come back to you. Would the investments look so much more attractive if fossil fuels weren't subsidized to such a great degree? I'm speaking to Dr. Birol again tomorrow, and one of his points I know is that we have trillions of dollars of subsidies for fossil fuels. If they weren't there, my goodness me, the business case for renewables would look jolly competitive. Would that make a difference if we removed a lot of subsidies? I mean, India's a great case in point where there are fuel subsidies.
Right, right. Perhaps yes, of course. I mean, I don't think there is any doubt there. But if I just look at the pie of renewables and how we can do better, if there is more innovation in the structures and the kind of products which are offered, and the amount of capital which is required, I'm sure we can, it's required. I don't think the financial institutions are doing as much as we'd like them to see.
One big failure.
When you're on a panel with Steve first time, you know, when he starts talking about that, you need to be careful. He's trapping you sort of.
Okay.
So therefore, just
that's very kind of you, Henrik. Thank you.
Space. I think here it's also we can always say capital should that be for free, and probably that drags also some of the wrong behavior. And we're coming out of a long period of time where no one needed to pay anything for cash or capital because it was interest rate zero and other stuff. And I think, yes, it's tough when suddenly interest rate goes up, yes. But the other thing which it does, it also highlights everyone on the stage here does actually interact with each other. So private sector comes to each other and saying, how does the PPA look like? And anything that comes and has a proper offtake at a proper market price, that gets financed anywhere in the world. It's only when you start saying this, well, it's convoluted, there is an open-ended risk, we don't know how it's going to be. And
I subscribe to Henrik. It has to be bankable projects, which means the technology is proven, the customer is there, they get financed. But they're more expensive. So because these are capital programs, the marginal cost of the sun and the wind is zero. So most of the energy cost is actually in the interest rate. So that's where governments can really help with lending programs.
Governments can really help by actually having a level playing field, by actually putting a price on carbon, which we didn't really make enough progress on, did we?
But allow the PPA, get the permitting done, then we will fix the rest.
We'll fix it.
I mean, from our standpoint, 3 years ago, during our Capital Markets Day, we put a $10 billion investment target for decarbonization to hit. Wow. And it was kind of a pretty bold move because the market price, reacted negatively that day. And now we look at it and we actually saved 40%. At the time we made this headline without full understanding, now we actually have a $6 billion fully financeable FS level feasibility studies. And we are making sacrifices because renewable projects for us will be about 8% cost of, rate of return versus in mining projects, we're looking for 12. So we have to make the right choices, but as far as capital, we had to make a decision not to pay dividends.
Alfred, I'll get a comment from you on capital and the price of capital, because obviously you're covering a whole host of products. How do you feel about it? I mean, obviously, yes, people are talking about the interest rate side, but I'm more talking about the level playing field between hydrocarbon and renewable.
I think the importance is really getting bankable projects to get customers to buy the things we started in 2022 to sell sustainable aviation fuels. And what you see there is that initially you find customers that will sign up for it, right? But not everybody will do it. Once the mandates come, a lot more people come in, and that's where the regulator, in my opinion, can help to create the right regulatory environment. But I do agree with you. I think in the end, the problem will only be solved if we unleash free market economy for all those projects that need to happen, and that will require a price on carbon eventually.
Even I, Henrik, have to finish a panel sometimes as well. So, despite the fact that I'm actually due now about 5 minutes' time to speak to another president, but yes, I am. Not about energy. But I want, in 10 seconds each maximum, one thing that can really get us going and accelerate the transition and get us towards goal, starting in 2024, getting us to 2030 and 2050 goals. Bold, I'll start with you, then I'll move down the line, and then I'll thank you all.
I think artificial intelligence will create a new pathway for material sciences and discovering.
How can I have a panel in Davos without mentioning AI?
Yeah, it has to.
So building factories for electrolyzers, bring the cost down from 800 to 400, makes hydrogen cheaper than oil. We can do that in 3 years. We have to build the factories. Governments need to focus on the supply side.
So says the hydrogen man, it's about electrolyzers.
I just think governments need to collaborate and do more together rather than look inwardly and do more for
And stop worrying about their electoral cycle and think about their children.
40% of the world, as you said, is going into elections. So.
Henrik?
Get permitting.
Permitting, governments again,
No, permitting. That goes for everyone, because permitting is not only governments, it's society.
Yeah.
It's society
It's all of us.
that creates the
It's us
permitting.
NIMBYs.
So I'm not throwing anyone under this bus, because it's permitting. Let's go back and do it wherever we live.
Alfred Stern.
Risk sharing for new innovation and technology.
What a great final round. We had a bit of everything there, didn't we? I mean, really, thank you very much. You know what, these things are always short and sweet by the nature of them, but Mark Alvera, Bol Badr, Vaishali Sina, thank you very much indeed. Alfred Stern, and I'm even going to thank Henrik Andersen.
You're not.
Thank you so much indeed, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
You are very, very welcome.
Thank you for the fun
panel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So, who's the next president you're going to talk to?
I've just been speaking to President Duda of Poland, and I'm going off now to speak to the President of Latvia.
What's your top question?
My top question is, well, it's about Russia.
It's about Russia?
It's about Russia because he's the former foreign minister. He's incredibly robust on foreign policy as well. He wants the Baltics and the whole of NATO to be more robust in facing down President Putin. That's where we'll start.
Well, good luck with your...
Good to see you. Thank you very much.
Steve, everyone. Okay, so our next session, as everyone rearranges the chairs again, the musical chairs on the stage, is with our CNBC host and executive producer, Tanya Pryor. Now, she's going to be taking over the Filecoin Sanctuary over the next hour, and she's going to be talking about equity and opportunity, philanthropy to leveling up. Now, equity is a really important issue. I think it's